Well, welcome back to another episode of the Always About People show. My name is Chris Allen, and here on this show, we try to cover all topics related to people as they impact the workplace and our environments. But we try to focus on the issues that are important to people today. And I am so excited about this episode. It is the beginning of Black History Month. But while I say that, I also want to be careful, because I don't want to make this topic just about 1 month a year. This is an important topic. Today, we're talking about intentional inclusivity. Before you make any judgments on it, before you succumb to any biases that you may have on this topic, I want to make sure that we open our minds and that we take time to listen and understand. And this topic is important in the workplace. It's important in our culture. It's important politically. It's important socially, philosophically, theologically, and all the rest. And so today we want to get into this conversation. I believe this topic is longer than just one episode, so we may be extending this, but I have a special guest joining me today for this conversation. Jarrod Barnes has spent much of his life in this topic on inclusivity. And even in his current role with Emerson Collective, he is spending time thinking through, what does it look like to be more inclusive in our cultures and in our workplaces and in our investments and everything else. And Jarrod will tell you a little bit more about his background, his career. He's made stops in sort of the football world and the education world. And this guy has spent time learning. And so we want to spend time listening today. I'm really excited about Jarrod joining me. Would you please help me welcome Jarrod Barnes? Jarrod, it is so awesome to have you today. I hope you're doing well.
Chris, good morning. Thank you for having me. Very excited about our conversation.
Yeah. So I know you're coming to us from the West Coast. I think it's still dark outside, but thanks for making time, carving out time in your schedule to be with us. So,
absolutely. Yeah. Sorry. I think it froze a little bit.
Yeah,
absolutely.
You're all right. So Jarrod, what I would love is if you would just take a few moments to share a little bit about your background, because I think it's really the diversity in your background and where you've gone with your life and what you're now passionate about. I think it needs a little bit of context. It would help our viewers if you just shared a little bit about, hey, where'd you come from?
Yeah. Chris, it's been a unique journey. I am originally from Columbus, Ohio, so very much grew up in a Midwest blue-collar family. I'm of mixed race, so my mother is white, my father was black, and for the longest time, this topic that we're going to talk about today of inclusion, of equity, of really diversity. I was born into it in a unique context, and so for myself, as I was navigating my own journey, the one place where I did feel safe the most was on a football field. And so at a very young age, I said, hey, let's get really, really good at the game of football and see where that can take us. Quite frankly, the community in which I came from, that was really my pathway to social and economic mobility. Had the chance to go play football in college at Ohio State, played with a lot of great players, a lot of great coaches. I'll share some more about that, but pursued the NFL. Had a number of tryouts, but never made an active roster. And so from there, I actually spent the first part of my career as a college football coach. So I was the defensive backs coach at Ohio State, then went down to Clemson University and worked in player personnel and recruiting there. And, constantly was passionate about the game of football, but saw a gap in how coaches, in a sense, were engaging with their players and, quite frankly, how athletes were maximizing their time as student athletes. And so ended up launching a company called Prime U that really served as a learning and development platform for sports teams, really identifying the white space, not only in terms of actual learning outcomes, but specifically post-sport career transition. And so that was, in a sense, my real life MBA. Worked with about 30 different teams, 3 different leagues. One of the teams we worked with was the LA Rams, who had a pretty big win yesterday, headed to the Super Bowl. So happy for them. Had a chance to join the Rams for 2 seasons, really in a unique role in overseeing at the time our player marketing efforts. So really that middleman between a Gatorade or any type of brand sponsor and a player. while also really dipping my toe into corporate innovation and really getting a sense of the macroeconomics of the NFL and an NFL franchise and what it might look like to engage not only with the startup ecosystem, but really corporate innovation as a whole.
Yeah.
Part of that innovation was really around people. And not, it wasn't always about improving the bottom line. It was about improving employee experience. And that is where I really leaned in and had taken a lot of these adjacent experiences as an athlete, as a coach, as an entrepreneur, and began to channel that into a specific domain. And the more I found myself talking to emerging leaders just within people management, within the startup ecosystem, I kept leaning in and found myself very quickly excited around the concept of venture capital, and really venture capital being the asset class that invests in emerging startups and infuses capital for companies to experience hyper growth over time. And so, really was self-taught into this space, spent about 18 months transitioning in, and found an incredible organization called Emerson Collective, which effectively, Emerson was founded about 15 years ago by Lorene Powell Jobs and the Jobs family. And we have both a for-profit and nonprofit side of the organization. Our nonprofit side, we own and operate about 6 entities across social justice, climate tech, inclusive finance, gang reduction, immigration. On the for-profit side, we essentially are a multi-stage investment fund. And so I spend the most time thinking about how might we invest in emerging early stage startups, specifically within my domain of the future of work and education, and not only making great investments, but helping entrepreneurs build great companies, and most importantly, build companies that are inclusive and going to make the world a better place. And I'll finish by saying that, my experience as an athlete, when we talk about inclusion, at a very young age, I realized that, my actions as an individual player, I played corner and safety. So my actions as an individual player would influence the rest of, in this football context, the defense, which would then influence the team, which would then influence our overall performance in the game and overall performance in the season. I found that that's very true when it comes to inclusion in the workplace, that your role as an employee has a direct impact on maybe your working team, which then has a direct role and direct impact on your department, which then has a direct impact on your organization and really our economy as a whole. So oftentimes when we talk about inclusion, it can seem that it's on the organization to do something. But I actually have found that it's the opposite. It's really, on us. So I know it's a bit long-winded, but it's been a unique journey. And that's what's really brought me here today.
No, that's an incredible introduction. And I was jotting notes as you were talking because there was so much that I want to follow back up on. The first of which is, can anybody grow up in Columbus, Ohio, and not go to the Ohio State?
It's an interesting brand, and I would say movement in the city of Columbus, right? It is, there's no pro sports team. We have the Columbus Blue Jackets, an NHL team, but Ohio State is such the heartbeat of that city. Yeah. Absolute incredible experience to play for the Buckeyes. But I enjoy being out in California. Right, there's Buckeye fans everywhere, but and nothing like the Midwest. But no, it's been great to be out here.
That's fun. You did forget one pro sports team, the Columbus Crew of the MLS. So, Jarrod, I'm going to hold that. Man. I'm going to hold that against you right now. But no. So, what's fascinating to me though about your story is you mentioned that football for you became this sort of avenue out, and I'd love for you to speak to that for a second. But I think what I should do quickly is just tell our viewers, this is obviously, you're watching a recorded session. It's playing for you live, but we're recording this. And Jarrod mentioned the big win yesterday for the LA Rams. And so we're sort of recording this on the final day of January, playing it to you live. But yes, there were some pretty good NFL games. And so we'll just sort of address that with everybody. But as you even engage with these recorded sessions, please leave comments, ask questions. We'll be following up on all of that later. So back to you, Jarrod. When you think about your time growing up in Columbus and then the opportunity to play football at the Ohio State. Tell me more about your comment that was sort of your way to something. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, quite frankly, living out here in California and seeing the perspective of what it's like to live on the coast, you just see the different what it's like to grow up in different contexts. Growing up in the Midwest, success and quite frankly career paths, it looked like a very specific vertical. And again, like I mentioned, the community in which I came from, that was specifically either through sports, through some form of formal education, and maybe even whether that's becoming a doctor or a lawyer. I would say very kind of more traditional career paths, which I think are fantastic. However, for myself, I didn't have many mentors, many folks who I saw who looked like me, who were pursuing that. Right, the folks who I saw who looked like me were predominantly in sports, and so that is what led to, quite frankly, my desire to excel in that field. And I wouldn't trade it for the world. I've been able to be blessed with some incredible experiences and perspectives through the game of football, which is led me to where I'm at today. But a big part of that is I didn't necessarily have the visibility into alternative career paths. I didn't necessarily see a clear roadmap through folks who looked like me. And I'm proud to say that landscape is changing every day, which is a big part of my motivation, a big part of the reason why I chose to pursue venture capital, specifically as an African-American man, where it's disproportionate representation. Less than 2% of venture capital goes to Black founders. About the same goes to Hispanic founders, and about the same goes to women founders as well. And so, entering an industry that is somewhat of a microcosm of a lot of the experiences I had as a young child. Fortunately and unfortunately, it's nothing new, but also was able to gain a lot of the perspective in what it's like to enter into a space like that. So I know that didn't directly answer your question, but that was a big part of the reason why sports were a huge part of my life growing up.
Yeah. Okay. So you while you were giving us a little bit of context on your background, you went through your time at Ohio State, then into coaching at Ohio State, I think defensive backs, and then ultimately to Clemson, where you were doing some personnel and some recruiting. But you said you'd come back to that experience. Was there something else that you wanted to touch on in your sort of college football or even coaching experience that you want to kind of address?
It's interesting. I mentioned kind of the working in player personnel and in recruiting, which in a sense is talent management for sports. Right. And so I share that because, when we talk about the importance of intentional inclusivity, it can be very easy. Myself at the time working in player personnel, you're seeing, 10,000 athletes for maybe 4 scholarship slots. Right.
Yeah.
And so it can be very easy to go on autopilot and kind of see what you want to see out of a specific athlete, out of a specific player, out of specific, I want to go to this high school because I know I'm going to get, great talent there. It can be, quite frankly, somewhat easy to slip into bias in a role of that nature. Very similar. I bring that up because, my context now in venture capital, we see over 2,000 companies a year and make about 30 investments. Right. Mm-hmm. And so that same process of bias, pattern matching versus pattern recognition, right? There's so many things we could dive into there in that process of what it's like to be intentional when you're looking at, large pools of talent, large pools of data, and you're trying to narrow that funnel down. That, in a sense, muscle was developed early in my career, which has been a huge foundation for how we actually practice that today, and can talk about tactically what that looks like for us. But that concept overall was a big part of what I took from my experience specifically as a coach and recruiter into my context today.
Okay, before we get specific, let's back up just a second, because I want to address that concept of biases right from the beginning. And I know that I mentioned to you before we started that I was reading this new book by Adam Grant, Think Again, and it has the subtitle, The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know.
Mm.
And in the book, and I love Adam Grant, psychologist from Wharton. I know that you have some connections to him as well. But premise of the book being that the way we think of things may not actually be the way they are. And in the book, he covers some examples. He even covers the rivalry between Ohio State and Michigan. He covers the rivalry between the Red Sox and the Yankees, and how fans can so dislike the other group. They take no time to actually understand the individual, but just dislike them, whoever they are. And the book goes through just really expanding our thought processes on how we've always thought about things. So you mentioned biases and the fact that we may have a bias towards looking at certain schools, towards being attracted to certain talent, towards being attracted to a certain skill set or a background or a college or whatever it might be, in particularly talent management. So what I'd love to do is now let's get specific. Again, we are talking about intentional inclusivity. And so, Jarrod, let's talk, how can we become more intentional? How can we, and again, whether we're white, male, female, doesn't really matter, but how can we collectively, all of us, become more intentional about inclusivity, maybe become aware of some of the biases that we may have, and how can that benefit us in the workplace?
Chris, it's a great question. And I'll start by saying I'm very much practicing this myself, right? Maybe for the sake of our conversation, there's a lot of definition and a wide range of definitions around bias. I simply consider bias perspective without feedback, right? You're simply, operating out of what you see without context of anything else around you. And so there are times where bias actually can be used to your advantage if you have conviction around, something. However, it's when you act on it without that perspective that oftentimes we see kind of this unconscious effect happen. And I think it really starts with self-awareness, right? It really starts with you practicing and really carving out that time to first understand that, hey, this is my thought, and really understanding what informed this thought, right? Anytime, as investors, we're always thinking forward, and we're thinking about the kind of second and third tier ripple effects downstream. But in order to actually, think about what's happening downstream, you must go back and say, well, what actually informed this thought, right? Where did this actually come from? And so I think that's, from my perspective, a great place to start, right? And really have that starting point of practicing self-awareness. And, anytime you have a gut feeling or an instinct, really unpacking that. Where did that instinct come from? What informed that perspective? What informed, my action when I said, X, Y, or Z to a colleague of mine, or during a meeting, or whatever it may be. So I'm a firm believer that that self-awareness is really the first step. One way to gain that is simply through feedback. Right. And you mentioned Adam Grant. If you look at Adam Grant and any of the startups he works with or emerging companies he works with, they all incorporate some form of feedback loop, whether that's through technology, whether that's, in the workplace with your peers. I'm a firm believer that, it can be it can be really, really hard to gain that self-awareness without feedback. Right. It does take effort. As we talked about, inclusion is very much a muscle. Right. And so in order to train that, it takes time. So firm believer in starting with self-awareness through feedback.
Okay. So stepping back for just a second, I think the greatest maybe practical insight you've given us is, just like in a team sport, it starts with the individual. So you said that you were a defensive back, a safety, that your role individually impacts the defense, which impacts the team, which impacts the university, which impacts the, college football in general. And in the same way, I think we sometimes say, well, inclusivity is the responsibility of the organization. And you mentioned that earlier, or the HR department needs to figure out how to do this. And what you've just given us is it really starts with the individual, and it starts with the individual becoming aware of where their thoughts, biases, perceptions come from. And the only way to actually do that effectively is to get feedback. Jarrod, feedback is a difficult thing because it uncovers some of my own insecurities. How do we help people get over some of these insecurities in a world where everything seems to be binary? There's right and wrong. There's black and white. There's political parties that are just so opposed to one another. It feels like we're getting further and further apart. How do we encourage people to come together and, even in insecurity, take feedback?
Chris, you're not wrong at all. Oftentimes, I hear feedback is the F word at work, and so it can be a true challenge, right? And all of us, have pride in what you do, and when someone shares something with you that, to your point, uncovers an insecurity, right? The number one inhibitor to progress, from my perspective, is actually defensiveness. Right. And so maybe starting from simply the aspect of awareness, that the more defensive I may get to feedback, it's actually going to limit my own progress. And as we talked about, limiting my own progress is going to have ripples across the organization and further. And so, again, it's not an easy thing, but to your point, how do you actually encourage it? Number one, I believe you have to create space for it and be intentional about that space that has been created. I don't know about you. There's a number of surveys and platforms and different activities you can do in the workplace. But until you create the space to actually spend time talking about that, whether that's from peer to peer, whether that's from a manager to subordinate, whether that's from a leadership down to manager, whatever it may be, right? I think that is the most critical aspect, is first simply creating the space, because it's a lot of information to process, right? And if we're kind of rushing from meeting to meeting, and we may be in between something, or I have a tight deadline ahead of me, I probably won't really sit and receive that feedback in the way that I could if there was intentional space created around that. Right. One practice that we've done with founders and entrepreneurs that we work with is what's called inclusion circles, or creating that space weekly, monthly, amongst your team, to really, whether that's talking about feedback, whether that's talking about areas you want to continue to grow in, right? It does take an aspect of embracing vulnerability that I think can be uncomfortable within the workplace. But kind of like we discussed earlier, right? It's that uncomfortability, it's that tension, right? That really, the more you can lean into that tension, ultimately, the greater the outcomes can be. I consider it back to a sports context, right? If you're lifting weights, if you want to get stronger, there is a performance terminology called TUT, or time under tension, right? The longer the time under tension, that is actually going to break down your muscles a little bit more, but ultimately allow them to grow back stronger. And so when I hear things or feedback in the workplace that it does not feel good, I consider that's just time under tension, right? I just have the squat rack on my back, or I'm on the bench press, whatever it may be. This is all part of the growth process. And so I'll close by saying to that word of growth, I think it really comes down to a growth mindset as well, right? It's so hard to receive that feedback if you believe that, performance or outcomes are fixed, right? If it's, hey, this is the way that it is, the way that it always has been, very, very hard to receive that feedback. And so, again, I know I shared a lot there, but the more we can create the space for that feedback to happen and receive it with a growth mindset, and allow ourselves to really sit in that feedback, one that's not only going to build stronger relationships horizontally amongst our peers, but perhaps even vertically throughout the organization.
All right. So much that I want to dig into here. And I guess highly from a practical standpoint, if we've got a leader watching this show, how does that leader actually create these inclusion circles? What does that actually look like, Jarrod? And how do we make those effective?
Yeah, and it's a great question. Back to the point on intentionality, it could look like as simple as, taking the first 5 to 10 minutes of a team meeting and coming with a series of questions or series of prompts for your team to discuss. It could look like something larger than that, and having more of a programmatic cycle throughout your team or your department. But I'm a firm believer in starting small to really allow for that buy-in amongst your team members, amongst your employees, right? And making sure that people have a level of psychological safety before, trying to enter into, some form of, workshops or programmatic content or anything of that nature, right? At the end of the day, you can have all the content in the world, but if your employees and your team don't feel psychologically safe, and they don't feel as if there's
Yeah.
dedicated time for them to share, what they're learning, and dedicated time to practice and engage in that vulnerability, a lot of that content may fall on dead ears, right?
Yeah.
And so it could be as simple as taking 5 to 10 minutes in the start of a weekly, bi-weekly, whatever that may be for you, right? The cadence we use is bi-weekly, and really practicing that. And what that does, again, it builds momentum, right? At the end of the day, I'm a firm believer that inclusion, yes, it's a practice, but it's very much a movement as well.
Mm.
It is not a static word, right? This is very much an action verb. This is an act you are doing. And so with that, in order to really build momentum within your team, within the workplace, start small, right? You
Yeah.
don't have to climb Mount Everest in one day.
Yeah. Okay. So, um, a couple just thoughts on what would be a question that you could engage your team in to just begin this process. Remember, we're talking, let's start really small. Let's talk inclusion circles, maybe biweekly cadence, start a meeting with a few questions. What would be an example of a question?
Yeah, I think a great place to start simply is by perspective taking. So this could be whether that's a current world event that's happening. This could be acknowledging a cultural holiday, right? We're talking about Black History Month. It could be very simply, right? Over the next, month. Hey, what does Black History Month mean to you? What's something that you've learned through Black History Month over the past, year or so? How has your perspective changed since 2020 around Black History Month? Right? These are all like, wow, these are big questions. But I'm a firm believer, as managers, and as someone who works with a number of entrepreneurs, you'll be surprised by the range of perspective that you hear. And again, this may be very different to engage within your team. And so maybe starting with something that could be a little bit, easier as an icebreaker, just to get the ball rolling. But I'm a firm believer in perspective taking as a great place to start prior
Mm.
to maybe talking about any individual or any specific thing. And so really starting, it could be with a world event or cultural holiday to recognize. And another one that's coming up is Lunar New Year, right, on February 1st, right? There's so many different things that we can recognize within the workplace, and the power that comes behind that. I'm a firm believer that part of the reason why some folks may or may not engage with folks from other backgrounds is simply they don't understand the culture, right? In transparency, I didn't fully understand Lunar New Year and what that holiday was until I actually spent time understanding the culture and talking to my Asian American colleagues. And what does this mean to you? And how might I celebrate this? How might I recognize this? Right? It's the small step to open up the conversation, right? Because again, the role, from my perspective, of a manager, a people leader, is simply to create space for your people to thrive, right? It's not solely on you to be the core driver of everything, right? You're simply creating the space for your people to thrive. How can you do that? Recognizing heritage, recognizing culture.
Mm.
And even if there's not someone on your team from that background, what an opportunity to bridge that conversation.
That's awesome. All right. So, Jarrod, we are already pressing up against our time for this episode. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this conversation needs to go longer. And so, as kind of a summary of what we've talked about, I would say, hey, in order to be intentional about inclusivity, we need to take the small step first. And instead of relying on organizations to take the step and to guide us, it starts with the individual. And if we as individuals would just take the time to understand and to listen and to engage with people who are slightly different than us, we might find that we have more in common than we actually have that's not common, or different or diverse. And so in this first conversation, we've talked about just one really practical step within your organization that as a leader, you could just create the space for some of these inclusion circles, and that they could just start with the simple beginning of a meeting, a few questions to begin to understand people's perspectives, as you said, and that just taking that first small step is a step towards us bridging the divide between what we think are two sort of diverse perspectives. And in reality, what we might find is that we're very much close. So, Jarrod, we need to continue this conversation. And so I'm making a decision on the fly. We're coming back for a second episode, but I will wrap this one. For those of you who follow us and watch us live, we would love for you to like, subscribe. Obviously, we're doing this show every Tuesday on YouTube, on LinkedIn, on Facebook, and we would love for you to hang with us. I promise you, we did not put Jarrod up to it, but the mission of Always About People is to help create cultures where people thrive. He used almost the same exact language. And so, Jarrod, I just want to thank you for joining me. We need to pick up this conversation in our next episode. Thank you for joining us today.
I'm so excited by the work of AAP, everything you all are doing, and looking forward to continuing the conversation. So thank you again.
Awesome.